Go to Deuteronomy chapter 18. Yes. Deuteronomy 18. Deuteronomy 18, verse 20, it says, "But the prophets which shall presume to speak a word in my name, which I have not commanded him to speak, or that shall speak in the name of their other gods, even that prophet shall die. And if thou say in thine heart, how shall we know the word which the Lord hath not spoken?" And he says, "When a prophet speaketh in the name of the Lord, if the thing follow not, nor come to pass, that is the thing which the Lord hath not spoken, but the prophet hath spoken it presumptuously, thou shalt not be afraid of him." And then go back to chapter 13, very similar concept. But Deuteronomy chapter 13, verse 1, it says, "If there arise among you a prophet or a dreamer of dreams, and giveth thee a sign or a wonder, and the sign or the wonder come to pass, whereof he spake unto thee, saying, Let us go after other gods, which thou hast not known, and let us serve them, thou shalt not hearken unto the words of that prophet or that dreamer of dreams. For the Lord your God proveth you to know whether you love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul. You shall walk after the Lord your God and fear him, keep his commandments, and obey his voice, and you shall serve and cleave unto him." It says, "And that prophet or that dreamer of dreams shall be put to death, because he hath spoken to turn you away from the Lord your God, which brought you out of the land of Egypt, and redeemed you out of the house of bondage, and thrust thee into the way which the Lord thy God commanded thee to walk in. So shalt thou put the evil away from the midst of thee." Tonight we're going to finish up our look into the LDS Church, and I thought it fitting to end with a more detailed look at Joseph Smith himself. I mentioned this last week with regards to the Book of Mormon and the LDS Scripture. The Book of, or rather the LDS Church, the Mormon Church, and any cult, all cults are a house of cards. If you can knock out the bottom card, which is whatever person started that organization, if you can knock out that bottom card, it will crumble apart. And there has probably not been a whole lot that has led to more Mormons leaving the church than just simply looking at the life of Joseph Smith. And so I think it's a good way to end this study to just take a closer look at his life, because he is the foundation of their church, and they admit this. They're not silent about this. In the book Joseph Smith's Testimony, which is promoted by the LDS Church, it says, "The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has its foundation in the revelations he received, the sacred truths he taught, and the authority of the priesthood received from him." And so it's fascinating that they say the church has its foundation. Look at this, nothing about God, nothing about Jesus. The Latter-day Saint has its foundation, the revelations he, Joseph Smith, received, the sacred truths he, Joseph Smith, taught, and the authority of the priesthood restored through him, Joseph Smith. Right? And so again, this is not me putting words into their mouth. This is their own testimony. And so, like I said, we have dealt with the supposed scriptures that he wrote. We've seen the falsities in theirs. And by the way, we'll see one more tonight, at least one more. However, it is also, I think, imperative to deal with the man himself. Now, we just read this, but the Bible gives us the test of a prophet. And interestingly, it's twofold. And I didn't put the Deuteronomy 13 reference in here. Maybe I should have. But in Deuteronomy 18, the test is quite simple. It's not a difficult test. If somebody claims to be a prophet and they prophesy, and whatever they prophesy doesn't happen how they said it would happen, that was not from the Lord. The Lord does not make mistakes. He sees the end from the beginning. He makes no mistakes with regards to prophecy, foretelling, anything like that. And so the first test of a prophet is if they say, "Thus saith the Lord," and it does not come to pass that way, it is a false prophet. And according to Deuteronomy 18, that person should be put to death. And so that's the first test. And maybe even more interestingly enough is the second test, which is Deuteronomy 13, which says even if that person makes a claim that comes true, but then they try to lead you to other gods, that is still a false prophet. Right? And so this is very much in keeping with what Paul said in the New Testament, which is, if I or any other person, even an angel from heaven, tries to teach you another gospel or to go another way, let them be accursed. And so Joseph Smith falls into both categories. He said things that are not true, and even if he ever said a prophecy that came true, he's leading them to other gods. So he fails every single test of a prophet. Now, nowhere does the Bible say that prophets are going to be sinless, right? And so I'm not trying to stand up here and say that, the prophets that we read of in Scripture never sinned. That's not my point. But there is a difference in a repentant prophet of God and a prophet, so-called, who seeks out opportunity to sin and is not repentant and is deceptive and leads other people into that deception. Right? I think we can honestly agree that there's a big difference in those two things. And so Joseph Smith lived a life full of immorality and lies. And I'm just going to show you just the tip of the scale tonight. I mean, just a drop in the bucket of the things that he did in his life. But a life full of immorality and lies. And like I said a while ago, he fails every test of what a genuine prophet of God should look like. And since this is the case, then the question has to be asked, is that the kind of man that God would use to restore Christianity, which is their claim, right? Christianity was corrupted. Joseph Smith had to come and restore it. If that is true, is that the kind of man that God would choose to use? And so, just to take a little bit of a closer look at his life tonight, we'll start with number one with false prophecies. And this is it's a lengthy lesson a little bit, but we're going to get through this quickly. And so, false prophecies. Now, Joseph Smith made a bunch of prophecies in his life that failed to come to pass. Now, I'm only going to discuss two in detail tonight because, there's a couple of reasons why. First of all, there's just too many to deal with. But second of all, a lot of these prophecies that he gave, he provided in the prophecy what I call an out. He gave himself an out. And I'll give you an example of this. Joseph Smith prophesied in 1835, the coming of the Lord, which was nigh, even 56 years should wind up the scene. That's what he said. In 1835, he said 56 years, that'll be it. That's why they call them Latter-day Saints. They're Latter-day Saints because they're living in the latter days. Everything's going to end soon. And so I'm not saying they're called Latter-day Saints because of this specific prophecy, but just because that's their doctrine. And so in 1835, 56 years. Now the church will say, well, it's not a false prophecy because he said should. It should wind up. And so if he said should, there's a possibility that it won't. Right? And so he built himself an out by saying the word should. Now, I ask, an LDS or Mormon or whoever, read through the scriptures. Read through the prophecies that are given. Go read the book of Daniel. Daniel doesn't ever say, when he's interpreting the dream of Nebuchadnezzar, this might be the might happen. These things should take place, but there's a chance they won't. That's not the language of biblical prophets. That's not the language of biblical prophecy. And so it's either thus saith the Lord, and it's 100% true, or it's false prophecy. And so you don't have to give yourself an out if you're truly speaking for the Lord. Now, obviously, that didn't happen, right? Obviously, the world didn't end 56 years after 1835, but the church will say, well, he said should, so it's not a false prophecy. Now, there were some other prophecies that he gave, where he didn't give himself an out. And so I want to look at two of those tonight. Now there are some others that I think we could have added in here. For instance, Joseph Smith prophesied that there were people who lived on the moon who were about as tall as normal people, but they lived to be 1,000 years and they dressed like Quakers. Okay, that was a prophecy by Joseph Smith. Now, to be fair, it was a fairly common thing to think in the early 1800s that the moon was occupied. A lot of people said that. Joseph Smith was not the only one. However, they weren't claiming to be prophets of God. They weren't claiming to be speaking for God. And so Joseph Smith might have been just, regurgitating a common talking point that was alive in that day and time. But you don't get that excuse if you're claiming to be a prophet of God. Right? You don't get to say, oh, whoops, everybody thought that was true. Well, it doesn't matter what everybody thinks. It matters what you're saying, thus saith the Lord says. And so Brigham Young said the sun was occupied. He said there were people living on the sun, which I find pretty funny. But nevertheless, you don't get that as an out if you're claiming to be a prophet. Now, so some others that are in their own scriptures, and that's why I chose these. These weren't written in a book. These weren't written in a journal. These are in their scriptures. And so in the Doctrine and Covenants, section 84, written in 1832, and the dates on these are very important, and they date them. This isn't us trying to guess. At the heading of every section of the Doctrine and Covenants, the dates of when these were written down are given. And so this isn't, we're not guessing this was 1832. Joseph Smith dated it for us, which is pretty handy for this. And so Joseph Smith wrote in 1832, he prophesied that a temple would be built in Independence, Missouri, or Jackson, I think it's Jackson County, but specifically Independence, Missouri. And he stated this in Doctrine and Covenants 84, section 84, verses 4 and 5. He said, which temple shall be reared in this generation? For verily this generation shall not all pass away until an house shall be built unto the Lord. Okay, so twice in a very quick order, this generation, it will happen in this generation. Now, obviously, there's all kinds of debate as to what constitutes a generation. There's passages in the Bible where people talk about that. Is a generation 60 years, 70 years, 100 years? Is it just if you were alive when that prophecy was given? Is the generation last until the last person who was alive dies? Right? And so that's an honest discussion, and I'll grant them that. However, here we are several, well past the time when anybody in 1832 was alive, and there's still not a temple there. Now, that doesn't, well, let me just read this. Over the next few years, here's what took place. He gives this prophecy in 1832. Over the next few years, there was great conflict between the Mormons and the non-Mormons who lived in Missouri, leading to what is called the 1838 Mormon War. And so they went to war with the people of Missouri, and that eventually led to the Missouri Executive Order number 44, which states, in part, the Mormons must be treated as enemies and must be exterminated or driven from the state if necessary for the public peace. And so the governor of Missouri came out and he issued this executive order which basically said, drive out every Mormon out of the state of Missouri. And so they were all wholesale thrust out of the state completely in 1838. Well, that was a problem because they had already bought property, in fact, laid a cornerstone for where the temple was supposed to be. That happened in 1832, but then they start getting in all these fights, and this war breaks out, and now they're expelled from the state in 1838. Now, that didn't stop the early church leaders from, there were so many quotes that I could have put in here. So many of the early church leaders said, it's going to happen. There will be a temple there within this generation. So many of them said this. I'll pull out two here from Joseph Fielding Smith, who was the direct descendant, a direct descendant of his brother, but also a president of the church. In 1931, so almost 100 years after the prophecy was given, Joseph Fielding Smith said, I firmly believe that there will be some of that generation who were living when this revelation was given, who shall be living when this temple is reared. And I do not believe that the Lord has to bound himself to accomplish the matter within 100 years from 1832, but he has the power to accomplish this before 1932 if he wills. And so he basically said, we have a year until it's 100 years removed from this prophecy. God can absolutely do it. Which, to be fair, if it's a true prophecy, God could have done it. He didn't. But later in 1972, again, as the president of the church, he finally kind of admits. Now, he's writing this in language that's acceptable, but he is admitting defeat in this quote. In 1972, he says, it may be reasonable to assume that in giving this revelation to the prophet, the Lord did have in mind the generation of people who would still be living with the 100 years from the time of the announcement of the revelation, and that they would enjoy the blessings of the temple, and a glorious cloud would rest upon it. It is also reasonable to believe that no soul living in 1832 is still living in mortality on the earth. And so his quote, what he's saying is, it is reasonable to believe that the Lord actually gave this prophecy, and it should have come to pass. It is also reasonable to believe that it hasn't. That's what he's saying in that particular quote. And so this is the president of the church admitting he got that wrong. Not just the passing statement Joseph Smith said to one of his friends. Supposedly this is a revelation, a direct revelation given to Joseph Smith by God, saying, in this generation a temple will be built in Missouri. That didn't happen. This is in their scriptures. You can go to Independence, Missouri today. Now, one of the One of the branches of the LDS Church, and there's a lot of different branches, one of the more fundamental branches of the LDS Church has purchased property, I think, near where the original temple was supposed to be built. I don't think it's on the exact property, and they have built a church there. But it's not a temple, and it's not by the mainline branch. And so, they still don't have a temple there. Because, by the way, and I don't know if I've ever mentioned this, there is a difference in a Mormon church and a Mormon temple. A Mormon church is where they kind of gather regularly for, preaching or whatever. And then it's a Mormon temple where the rites are done. You baptize there, you get married there, you do the endowment there. You don't do that in a Mormon church. It's only in a temple. So there are several churches in DFW. I think there is one temple, in DFW. But there is a difference there. But nevertheless, again, this is an objectionably false statement supposedly given to Joseph Smith by revelation from God that did not come to pass. Another one, similar thing. Doctrine and Covenants, chapter 114, verse 1, written April 1868. So in April 1868, verily thus saith the Lord, it is wisdom in my servant David W. Patton that he settle up all his business as soon as he possibly can, and make a disposition of his merchandise, that he may perform a mission unto me next spring, in company with others, even 12 including himself, to testify of my name, and to bear glad tidings unto all the world. 3 months after that, Smith writes that those 12 men, including David Patton, were supposed to leave for that particular mission on the 26th day of April next. And so in April, or in 1868, in Doctrine and Covenant, chapter 118, verse 5, it says, in 1869, on the 26th day of April, David Patton and 11 men were going to leave, and they were going to go on a mission. David Patton died in October of 1838. Not making light that the fact the man died, but this is not a mistake that a sovereign God makes. This doesn't happen. If we take the words of Scripture as true, and Deuteronomy 18, the test of a prophet says if he says something's going to happen and it doesn't, he is a false prophet. He is to be put to death. That's what the test of a prophet tells us is true. Now, like I said, there's hundreds of prophecies we could have discussed, but these two are in their scriptures, and there's no way to talk around it. He said this temple would be there within a generation. It's not. He said David Patton would go on a mission the next year. He didn't. I mean, there's no way to get around these. These are false prophecies that are in their scriptures given by Joseph Smith. And so that's just one area of his life. And so he is a liar. I mean, he is an absolute liar, not just with regards to these things, but with what we'll talk about next. And so one of the other issues, like I said, that this next issue that we're going to talk about, these are the things that typically Mormons don't know. The average Mormon don't know this because a lot of Mormons are second, third, fourth generation, and they don't tell them about these things. Obviously, they're not going to say, hey, next week's the class on the flaws of Joseph Smith. They don't do that. And so a lot of them don't know, for instance, the history of Joseph Smith's polygamy. They know that the Mormon Church has a history of polygamy, but most of them think that was Brigham Young. Most of them don't even know that Joseph Smith was involved in it. And so, with just two more things before we close, with regards to his immoral character. Joseph Smith's early life, and this isn't even a question of if, it is documented. Joseph Smith's early life was rife with occultism and folk magic. His family had a long history of being involved in occultism and folk magic. And again, this isn't even questionable things. Joseph Smith was known as a treasure digger. And what that was is a person who would use some kind of object to divine where there was buried and hidden treasure. And people would pay the diviner to use whatever implement. Sometimes they would use wishbones. Sometimes they would use various occultic type instruments. Joseph Smith's tool of choice was a seer stone, which obviously we know he used when he came to translating the Book of Mormon. And so he would use this seer stone, and he would see in the seer stone where there was buried treasure. And people would pay Joseph Smith to take them to this buried treasure. And the con was they would start digging, and as they were supposedly getting close to where that treasure was, Joseph Smith would say, oh, somebody put an enchantment upon that, and as soon as you touched it with your shovel, it disappeared. And so that was kind of the con. People would pay him. He would say, here's the treasure. As soon as they would dig, something would happen, and that treasure would be gone. Well, he did this and eventually was sued. And so there was a court or a trial that took place in 1826. Sometimes it's referred to as the glass looker trial because sometimes these diviners were called glass lookers. And so he was taken to court, interestingly enough, by the son of one of the men he had conned on this. And so the guy paid, just like everybody else, hey, I'm going to pay you some money, you find me some treasure. Obviously, they never found it. And so the guy, interestingly enough, still, even while Joseph Smith was being sued, fully believed in it. He testified on behalf of Joseph Smith. But his son sued Joseph Smith because he was like, it's been a month, and we paid all this money. Where's our treasure? You're conning us. Interestingly enough, the Mormon Church and Mormon scholars for years said this trial never happened. They said for years they're mistaking it. Joseph Smith was involved in a trial in 1830, and they're just mistaking the trial of 1830 with one that supposedly took place in 1826. Well, I don't remember the exact date, but along the line, those court records were found. And so we have the court records showing us that Joseph Smith was found guilty and was to pay a fine. Now, it wasn't a hefty fine, but in 1826, it was a whole lot more than it is now. He had to pay a fine of $2.68. We have the receipt that shows that what he was accused of, and he had to pay $2.68. He was sued for, I think, criminal mischief. But the categories of criminal mischief included treasure digging and divining and con men, things like that. And so he was found guilty of that, ordered to pay a fine of $2.68. This date is significant. 1826 is significant because this is supposedly 6 years after the first vision. It was during the time where over a couple of years the angel Moroni was visiting Joseph Smith, telling him about the golden plates, and only about a year or 2 years before he supposedly started translating those golden plates with a seer stone. And so the reason why I bring all this up is because clearly Joseph Smith was still involved in occultic practices during the foundation of the religion that he started. Right? He brought those occultic practices into the LDS church. And so, again, but he's a con man, a convicted con man. He was involved in folk magic and occultism. And again, this is supposedly the man who's restoring Christianity. And then we get to the last thing, which is probably the thing he's most well known for outside of starting the church. But it is a widely known and, I will say, well-documented fact that Joseph Smith was a polygamist. And not just a polygamist, he wasn't just involved in polygamy, he was involved in polyandry. And the difference between that is that not only did he have multiple wives, but he had multiple wives who were married to other men. That's polyandry. And so he was a polygamist. He had a number of wives, and that number of the number varies. People disagree on the exact number. Now I will say this, whatever. Some of those wives were sealed, what they said, for time and eternity, meaning you're my wife now, you'll be my wife in eternity. Some of those women were sealed only for eternity, meaning you're not my wife now, but you will be when we go make our planet and become gods, and all that. And so meaning it is possible that with some of these wives he did not have any physical interaction with, but the ones that were sealed for time and eternity he most definitely did, and that's only speculation to say that he didn't have any physical interaction with those other women. Now, the church itself has had a terrible time attempting to clarify and justify, which they do try to justify in certain ways, but they have tried to clarify and justify the actions of Joseph Smith with regards to this polygamous actions. Now, part of the reason why they have such a hard time is because Joseph Smith consistently lied about his involvement with it. For instance, and this isn't the only time he made a statement with regards to he wasn't involved, but in 1844, when they suppose he already had over 25 wives, in 1844 he said, "What a thing it is for a man to be accused of committing adultery and having 7 wives when I can only find one." And so he made statements like this all the time, trying to say that he wasn't involved with polygamy. However, even now, the church admits, the LDS church admits that he probably had upwards of 40 wives. 40 wives. Many of which were already married when he married them. Now, in this lesson, I use the term sealed. That's their term. That's how they talk about it. So, fine. I'll use your terminology, but it means marry, okay, just so we understand this. And so he was sealed to upwards of 40 women. Like I said, a lot of them were already married. There is strong evidence to suggest that with a few of them, he specifically sent their husbands off on a mission so that he could seal their wives while their husbands were gone. Like I said, I don't think you could technically prove that, but there is a lot of evidence to suggest that. Now, at least one of these women, and there's probably more, at least 2 or 3 who are this age, but at least one we know for a fact, Helen Mar Kimball was 14 when they were sealed. She would later write to her children in a book that Joseph Smith told her, if you will take this step, it will ensure your eternal salvation and exaltation, and that of your father's household and all of your kindred. This promise was so great that I willingly gave myself to purchase so glorious a reward. This is what he's doing. This is predatory behavior. Joseph Smith, who at this point already had all this influence, comes and tells a 14-year-old girl, if you'll just marry me, your whole family will be exalted. You'll get to be with your family in eternity. You'll get to have everything you want in eternity. What 14-year-old girl talking to the founder and prophet of their religion is going to say, well, no, I don't want my family to have an eternal reward. I don't want my family to be eternally exalted. This is predatory behavior. In 1831, Joseph and his wife Emma moved to Kirtland, Ohio, where they were eventually introduced to Sarah Ann Whitmer, who at the time was 6, Mary Rollins, who at the time was 11. Both of these girls would later go on to be sealed to Joseph Smith. 6 years old is younger than April. And so, this is a man around my age, maybe a little bit younger than me, seeing a girl younger than April and later on marrying her. With regards to Mary Rollins, she was not technically sealed to Joseph Smith until 1843, so she was a little bit older, but she would later write that Joseph Smith told her, I was the first woman God commanded him to take as a plural wife, and that supposed revelation to Joseph Smith came to him in 1831 when Mary Rollins was 11 years old. And so he is a 30-plus-year-old man. He was supposed to marry this 11-year-old girl. Doctrine and Covenant, section 132. The whole chapter is about plural marriage, and it's a really long chapter. The section gives, in this particular section, God supposedly, right, from their perspective, God gives Joseph Smith what they call a new and everlasting covenant. And you find that phrase throughout that chapter, if you're involved in the everlasting covenant. Well, what's the new and everlasting covenant? Plural marriage. That's the covenant. Because God gives Smith this new and everlasting covenant, specifically because Joseph Smith, in verse 1, inquired of my hand to know and understand wherein I, the Lord, justified, get that, justified my servants, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, as also Moses, David, and Solomon, my servants, as touching the principles and doctrine of their having many wives and concubines. And so we'll see that in their scriptures, not only do they say that God commanded it, but that he justified it. And so because God supposedly commanded and justified all these other men to have these many wives and concubines, now Joseph Smith should have this as well, which I just want to point out very quickly. Isaac did not have multiple wives and concubines. He was only married to Rebekah, so that's a factual inaccuracy in the scriptures there. And we don't know about Moses. We know that Moses had 2 wives, but the scripture never says that they were simultaneous. He had Zipporah, and then he married the Cushite woman. We don't know if Zipporah had died before he married the Cushite woman. And so, again, we cannot say whether or not that happened at the same time. Did it happen at that time? Yes, it happened. Abraham did have multiple, right? These things were true, but God never commanded it, and he certainly didn't justify it. And so, again, we can see predatory behavior written by this man to justify his own perversions. Later in that same chapter, God commanded Abraham, and Sarah gave Hagar to Abraham to wife. And why did she do it? Because this was the law, and from Hagar sprang many people. This, therefore, was fulfilling, among other things, the promises. And so the natural inclination is, well, if Joseph Smith wants to fulfill the promises, he needs to have a lot of wives, and he needs to have a lot of children. And if that's not bad enough, and it is, later on in that same chapter, and this just, honestly, it angers me. Later on in that same chapter, he writes, supposedly under revelation from God, let thine handmaid Emma Smith, and so he specifically calls out his own wife in their scriptures, let thy handmaid Emma Smith receive all those that have been given unto my servant Joseph. A couple verses later, and I command my handmaid Emma Smith to abide and cleave unto my servant Joseph and to none else, but if she will not abide this commandment, she shall be destroyed. So Joseph Smith is writing this commandment about himself, saying God commanded and has justified now me to have all these wives. And by the way, Emma, if you complain or if you try to take another husband, God's going to kill you. And he's putting that into their scriptures. This man, it makes me angry. It makes me sick. And if Mormons could just understand this, I think more and more of them would see the truth of the man that they think restored Christianity. It's a ridiculous claim to make. Now, one other thing on this. Doctrine and Covenants 132 was written in 1843. Now, we already know in 1831, supposedly God told Joseph Smith to marry an 11-year-old girl. And so clearly Joseph Smith was already thinking about a plural marriage long before 1843. So, in accordance with that, the Mormon Church puts at the heading of that particular chapter, although the revelation was recorded in 1843, evidence indicates that some of the principles involved in this revelation were known by the prophet as early as 1831. What is that evidence? That God told him to marry an 11-year-old girl in 1831. That's the evidence. And so the principles found in this, it wasn't given until 1843, but Joseph Smith must have just known it. Because how else can you justify desiring to marry an 11-year-old girl? The pattern of Joseph Smith's life was one of conniving other people to get what he wanted. His whole life was this way. And by the way, there's a long history of Joseph Smith excommunicating people who went against him. If you did anything against Joseph Smith, you're gone. You're excommunicated. You're out of the church. And so this, again, he's a con man. From start to finish, Joseph Smith is a con man. He was immoral throughout his life. He carried occultism into his new religion. And when his life is seen objectively, it becomes clear that he is not the man of God that the LDS church portrays him to be. And this is some of the reasons why I've said from the very beginning, why I wanted to do this is, and I've said this several times about several of the topics we've talked about, your average Mormon doesn't know this. They've been duped. They've been deceived. They've had the wool pulled over their eyes. And so it grieves my heart to think of, and I mean, what's the common picture when people think about Mormons? They're some of the kindest people you'll ever meet. Right? I mean, I don't think I've ever met a mean, grouchy Mormon. Right? They're always super kind, and it just it grieves my heart to think of the fact that they've been, 150 years later, they're still following the lies of a con man. And if they continue this, there's not a path of exaltation that's awaiting them in eternity. And so, I hope, like I said, this is our last section on Mormonism. I hope this has been helpful, and hopefully, if you know anybody involved in the church, or if you come across one, this is information that can help you try to help them come to see and know the truth, because it is a sad thing. Starting next week, my plan originally was to move on to Jehovah's Witness. We will get to them, but I very often kind of mistake Jehovah's Witness and Mormonism in my head, some of the things that they believe. And so I thought it'd be a big mistake for me to try and do that back right on the heels of talking about Mormonism. And so starting next week, we're going to look at Islam. And that's a whole other, difficult situation with Muhammad and all that. But we'll start taking a look at that next week. I don't know how many, for sure 3. I've got 3 planned for each of these. That might turn into more. It'll just depend on when I really start digging into it deeper and seeing what all I want to get into. But that will be next week. Okay. For prayer requests, the really only one I've got is we still have